Three things real estate investors need to know today. First, it's the Landlord Tenant Board's fault. Secondly, rents are increasing. Thirdly, there's some amazing opportunities out there. And that's why I've invited Tom Cahill with Real Property Management out of Hamilton and that part of Ontario to join me. And we're talking real estate investors need to hear.
Thanks, Patrick. A real pleasure to be here.
So Tom, you're based out of Hamilton. Do you cover all of Hamilton, portions of Hamilton? What do you got going on?
Yeah, we're covering the whole city of Hamilton. You know, at this point, I've got some clients out in Oakville, but right out to Niagara Falls and Brantford. So the whole region, really.
Okay, so, we come in with this lead that it's the Landlord Tenant Board's fault. And I have to say that being based in Western Canada, primarily with my own portfolio in Alberta, when I look at what's happening in Ontario and I look what's happening in British Columbia, Ontario is even worse than British Columbia. And, let's talk about what are some of the challenges that the Landlord Tenant Board is creating for us and why it's so important to have property management. And I'm going to just bring that up a notch and say asset management. So talk to me about how property management supports investors given what's going on with LTB.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, just to start out by saying none of these issues are easy to tackle. We've got our government trying, good luck, but they're complex issues. And when we try to get a Band-Aid on it, like the Landlord Tenant Board, honestly, it just makes things a lot worse for everybody.
Yeah.
And I think what we have here in Ontario is a piece of legislation in the Residential Tenancy Act that is truly in the favor of the tenant. And there's no doubt tenants need protection. I think we all could admit, and probably have met a few along the way, that there's bad landlords out there. But what this piece of legislation is doing, and the Landlord Tenant Board, is breeding a whole group of bad tenants. And as investors, we're in an interesting position as property managers, but also investors. On the investor side, we need to do everything we can to protect ourselves. And what you're seeing as a result of this poor legislation is a lot of vigilante type activities out there. One example would be openroom.ca or org, I can't recall. But here's a forum where landlords can upload, tenants as well, rulings from the LTB. So as part of our process in screening tenants is that we hop over there and check out to see if there has been some rulings against a tenant. It's not to say that they're an automatic no, but we need the full story because it's almost the only insurance and protection that we have as investors. On the tenant side, I don't think it's making it any easier for them. So if you do get into trouble and you have a ruling against you, it's almost like a credit now, kind of tenant behavior. So I think it's harder for some tenants to achieve housing and good housing.
So as much as we like to, blame the Landlord Tenant Board, it's why we have RPM, Real Property Management. It's why we have property management that I know that RPM and I like to refer to as asset management, Tom. So give us a little bit of insights into what RPM is, regardless of what the LTB does or doesn't do.
Sure. Patrick, I agree. I think the LTB have created a certain landscape and it is what it is. But what that landscape is now, certainly in Ontario here, is one that's more complex than perhaps it needs to be. And this is where the benefit of a group or a partner through your property manager comes into play, where we've got the expertise, the know-how, and the protections to protect you and your asset.
RPM is interesting because you're national in scope. Your franchises are right across the country. You get together as a team. I've had the privilege of being able to speak at some of your annual franchisee events and meetings, and I love doing it. I love meeting the different franchisees right across, but you guys connect, you share information, you share insights. One of the things that I've learned as an investor myself is that when you get into that property management side of the equation, there is so much to know when it comes to, for example, in Ontario, a very complex LTB, the rules and what's going on with tenants, what's going on within what you can do and you can't do, what you can say and you can't say, what you have to accept on your applications. So are you constantly being updated? Like, it seems so overwhelming as an investor. I don't want to know that all, I don't want to have to know all this stuff. Is it really that complex? And are you constantly learning?
I mean, general life philosophy is that yes, I'm constantly learning.
Yeah.
Within property management, always, right? This is a very dynamic, layered business. So on the nuts and bolts of property management, relatively simple, but that's also, learning and evolving as situations come up. The LTB and issues there and timelines and delays, we're learning about that and adjusting and acting accordingly. As a national network, yeah, we talk a lot about certainly the nuts and bolts of property management, but then we'll dive down into region specifics. So in Ontario, we've got a separate group who will get together. We can really flesh out kind of what's happening at the LTB, what's current experience at the LTB, and how are we best protecting our clients' assets in response.
When I think about investors, what I've come to learn is that many investors don't want to get too engaged with their tenants. They don't necessarily stay up to speed with increasing rents when they can. They're going, oh, I can only increase it by 2.5% or whatever the number is. And they go, why bother? And then they leave it. What are some of the things that you see investors step over because they're either too busy, don't understand, are afraid to be, or maybe they're afraid to lose a good tenant by increasing rent too much? That's a common one that I see. But what are some of the common? I don't want to call them mistakes, but what are some of the common things that you see investors step over when it comes to property management / asset management?
Tenants are the heartbeat of our investments. They are our customers, and so where I see some issues arise is when investors don't treat and look at tenants that way. So if you have a business and you've got a customer, are you going to ignore their calls? Are you going to treat them poorly? I think that business is going to start declining pretty quickly. So, going back to the nuts and bolts of property management, that's sure one aspect, but at the root of it, we are a customer service business. And if we can't thrive there, then we're in trouble and we get ourselves into trouble. So I think that perspective and approach with our clients, with our tenants is critical for success.
Tom, now you've been doing this a long time and you've been kind of in the world of Hamilton. And, we know that real estate's regional. We know market rents and what's going on in the market is very regional. What are you seeing that's happening in Hamilton that leaves you optimistic or maybe leaves you a little bit nervous about what's going on? Both sides. Why don't we look at both sides of given what's going on in Hamilton?
Yeah, so if we focus specifically on Hamilton, man, there's a lot going on here. I'll say 10 years from now, this is a very different city. So that's really exciting in itself. But one thing that is important to consider when investing into different communities is economy and diversity of what the city is doing. So Hamilton, we have that. We've got varied industry. We're not quite a bedroom community to Toronto, but we could be. So we've got that population too. A massive industry in Hamilton Health Sciences. So, very diverse. And the way we see that translate over to rents is a pretty good pool of renters. So, we tend to get a good pick of the crop, if you will, and increasing rents. Piece of news just came out this week that we've seen an increase month over month in Hamilton in rent, and now the average one-bedroom apartment is, I think it's at $1,932. So this is unprecedented. So we saw a softening of rents, but not a decline, and now we're going the opposite. We're seeing an increase in rents.
So when I look at Hamilton, I see it as a city that the economic development has been pretty progressive over the years, in terms of, expanding in the city, drawing and attracting businesses into that city, which represents jobs, which represents population growth, which means, of course, that people are going to move into that city and many of them are going to rent. And so when we look at Hamilton, we see that economic development as being quite progressive. Is that how you see it? I mean, your boots on the ground, is that how you see it as well?
Yeah, we do get an interesting perspective on economies. Generally, yes. We've seen maybe some shifts in the population looking for apartments right now, which I think is mirroring the economy. So a lot of good tenants are holding tight with what they've got, really listening and feeling that uncertainty. Um, but even with those headwinds, like I said, we're seeing increases in rent. So things continue to churn. A year and a half ago, I would have a lineup to rent an apartment. Now it's taking, maybe an average month to 2 months, depending on the unit. So those dynamics have just shifted.
I've seen in other cities that I've talked to property management about and investors about, and they're actually saying that, with the population growth, and this is a mistake that investors who don't have property management, I think it's a mistake and oversight that they have, is that given population growth, it's not uncommon to get, let's say, 25 or 50 applications, depending on region. But out of those 25 or 50, when you do background, all of a sudden the dynamic of the quality of those individuals is far different. When it comes to credit ratings, when jobs, when you start doing the diligence behind it, you find out that out of those 25 or 50 applications, there literally is one or two that makes sense. Are you finding that? Are you having that same experience in Hamilton, or how is it there? Are you finding that although it takes a month or two to get the right application, is it a slowdown of volume, or are you still getting a lot of applications, but you're having to really screen those, which is an important part of any property management? What's your experience right now?
Yeah, current state, definitely a lower flow of quality applicants.
Mhm,
And so what that comes with is a lot of work. Uh,
mhm,
we've got units that I'm getting over 1,000 inquiries, many, many showings, and from that, a handful of applications. So that's upfront screening process. Meeting the tenants. That's a little bit more arduous these days. But we get through it, and still we're landing solid tenants, but not through without wading through a lot of applicants and screenings.
I think that's such an important part and something we need to shine a light on. When you look at real property management and you look at your team and what you do in behind, having these systems in place, having also the operational wherewithal to actually go through that search and that filtering and those and the homework you got to do, the diligence you got to do on tenants to get a great tenant. Because again, going back to LTB, it doesn't matter what we think of LTB. We can be very critical of it. It's easy to be in Ontario, very critical, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
And the point is that is the sandbox that we have to play in. It's their sandbox. They make the rules, and we have to work within those rules, which means that from my perspective anyways, Tom, and I'm sure you agree, although investors don't necessarily think that there's big value in property management, just the screening process in today's Ontario market is absolutely critical, that you put the right tenant in place. And even at that, it's hard work. So am I on the right track given what you guys do and what's happening in that Ontario market?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the screening feels these days is more an art than a science. We
Mhm.
certainly apply the science to it, but this is a dynamic consideration. As I mentioned, 2 years ago, it was a lot easier. We had a very large pool of good quality tenants. These days, you just need to scrutinize differently. A
Mhm.
bad credit doesn't translate necessarily to a bad tenant.
Mhm.
Here, you need to dig in and look at the behaviors, right? We came off COVID, and a lot of people struggled. That
Mhm.
wasn't their fault. So, you need to enter it with a good dose of empathy,
Mhm.
but really scrutinize and make sure that you're getting, the right tenant, that their stories are matching, what you're seeing on paper, qualifying that paper that you're getting. We're seeing more fraudulent papers come in. So, yeah, it's just become more dynamic, and we just need to feel it through a bit more and consider maybe more broadly than we would have before.
Now, I know that, when we talk about property management and being an investor, risk mitigation is really important. And there's all sorts of ways to mitigate risk when you're doing the deal, getting the deal done, completing the deal, all of the diligence that goes into buying that piece of property. You spend a lot of time, you invest, we go through all the things. So really, RPM really lives into this story, not a story, but it is a philosophy that this isn't property management, this is asset management. So when we look at asset management, we look at a full scope of things. Number one, we talked a lot about choosing the right tenant, but in behind all that, there's maintenance and there's marketing and there's, what would you expand on when you think about what you do as asset management? What's some of the scope of thoughts that you have on asset management, Tom?
Yeah, hey, these are our big assets that we've got. We've put a bunch of money into them, but they don't just sit idle there. If you don't keep on that maintenance ends up being a lot more expensive than if you were more proactive. So that would definitely be one area that we're keeping a keen eye on these homes and identifying areas of issue and strategically addressing those. Obviously a leak is a leak, but if you've got gutters that are starting to get old, we can kind of take that and say, okay, we don't need to do that today, but in the next 3 whatever years, we should really do that. So let's think about a reserve or a timing that makes sense. So this is the view that we take to protect those assets, in addition to making sure that we've got the right tenants in there.
So when we look at real property management, when we look at what you do in Hamilton, what would be one message or two messages? What is the key that you want a listener to know about property management and what RPM does?
Yeah, so property management, as I said before, is a customer service business. And we have a really great opportunity to address 2 customers, really 3. One being our owners. The needs of our owners are very different to our other customer, which is our tenants. And then the third customer would be our vendors, right? We need to take care of that group to ensure it all churns well. But yeah, it's a complex business, and you need to chameleon yourself for greater success.
I love it. Tom, I want to say thank you for your time. Folks, if you're listening to this, understand that, when it comes to looking after our assets and our investments, there is a point in play that we have to consider that it's not our area of expertise to try and micromanage a piece of property and deal with the day-to-day or week-to-week or month-to-month issues that can start to show up. And that's why we bring in professionals who have systems in place, who have processes in place, and who have the experience in dealing with hundreds of doors and hundreds of tenants and the different profiles that show up. So I encourage you, reach out to Tom and his team at RPM in Hamilton and surrounding area, have a conversation with them, and really start to understand what asset management is all about and why RPM and Tom Cahill can support you in doing that. Tom, thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Patrick. A real pleasure.